The world of the early 20th century breathed with a slow and deliberate rhythm that felt as steady as the turning of a heavy wooden wheel upon a dusty road, where the morning sun rose over vast stretches of untouched countryside, and the only sound to greet the day was the soft rustle of wind through the tall prairie grass, or the distant rhythmic clip-clop of a horse's hooves against the cobblestones, as people lived their lives within the gentle confines of their own small towns, and the idea of speed was something reserved for the flight of a bird or the rush of a mountain stream, for in those days the pace of existence was measured by the natural cycles of the earth and the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in a quiet hallway, while the air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth rather than the frantic energy of the modern age. And as you imagine yourself standing on a quiet street corner in a sleepy American town in 1903, you can feel the stillness of the air and the way the shadows stretch long and lazy across the wooden storefronts, where the local blacksmith works with a slow and steady hammer, creating sparks that dance in the dim light of his shop, while the townspeople move with an unhurried grace, nodding to one another as they pass. Because in this era, there was no rush to be anywhere other than where you were at that very moment. And the concept of luxury was something found in the fine stitching of a handmade quilt or the polished silver of a tea set kept behind glass in a parlor that was only opened on the finest of occasions. For the world was large and mysterious, and travel was a grand undertaking that required patience and a willingness to see the landscape change inch by inch through the window of a slow-moving carriage. And as the evening settles over this old world, you can imagine the soft golden glow of oil lamps flickering in the windows of white-painted houses where families gather around heavy oak tables to share a meal that was grown in their own gardens and cooked over a fire that provided both warmth and light. And the silence of the night was a thick and comforting blanket that muffled the world and allowed the mind to wander through dreams of simpler things, like the sound of a porch swing creaking back and forth in the breeze, or the distant, lonesome whistle of a steam train pulling into a station miles away. And it is within this quietude that our story begins to focus on a single location where the future was being forged in silence and shadow, a place where the air felt thick with the scent of oil and iron and the promise of a change that would eventually ripple outward to touch every corner of the globe. Yet even here, in the birthplace of industry, the work was slow and methodical, as men with calloused hands labored over heavy frames of steel and wood, carefully fitting each piece together with a level of care that felt more like art than manufacturing, as they moved with a synchronized slowness that mirrored the world outside, and the shadows of the rafters played across the floor in long, elegant lines that seemed to point toward a horizon that no one could yet see. And as you breathe in the cool night air of this bygone era, you feel your body becoming heavy and relaxed, just like the heavy iron tools resting on the workbenches after a long day of honest labor. And the flickering light of a single candle casts a warm and steady glow over the blueprints of a machine that would one day move the world, but for now remains a silent dream in the mind of its creator.
That made a soft scratching sound against the paper, and each line represented a part of a whole that would eventually move with a synchronized grace that the world had never seen before. He thought of the iron being melted in the great furnaces, where the heat is a constant and comforting presence, and how that liquid metal would be poured into molds to cool and harden into the bones of a machine that would eventually carry families to picnics, and workers to their jobs, and dreamers to their destinations. And the beauty of this idea lay in its repetition, in its simplicity, because he knew that if he could make every part exactly the same, then the car could be built with a precision that eliminated the need for hurried adjustments or frantic repairs. So he paced the wooden floors of his laboratory while the crickets chirped outside in the tall grass and the stars turned slowly in the velvet sky above Michigan, and he whispered to himself about the power of the many over the few. And you can imagine the weight of the heavy iron wrenches as they lean against the brick walls, and the cool sensation of grease on a steady hand as the first prototype began to take shape under the soft yellow glow of a kerosene lamp that flickered just enough to make the shadows move like gentle waves on a quiet lake. There was no rush in his heart, only a deep and abiding patience that felt like the growth of an oak tree or the steady flow of a river toward the sea. And as he worked, the world outside continued its slow and sleepy existence, unaware that a revolution was being born in a small shed filled with the smell of gasoline and ambition. He wanted the great multitude to feel the wind in their hair and the freedom of the open road, which at that time was just a dream of dust and distance. But in his mind, those roads were already paved with the intentions of 1,000,000 people moving together in harmony. And as you drift further into this story, you can feel the heavy blankets of sleep pulling at your senses, just as the gravity of the earth pulls at the wheels of a stationary carriage, and the air in the room becomes still and warm and safe. Henry thought about the family sitting on their porches in the twilight, and how they would one day look at his creation not as a mechanical monster, but as a friend that opened up the world and made the distances between neighbors seem smaller and more manageable. And he saw the assembly lines of the future moving with the slow and inevitable pace of a glacier, where every man knew his place and every bolt found its home without a single moment of wasted energy or loud noise. It was a vision of perfect order and quiet efficiency that felt as natural as the rising of the sun and the setting of the moon over the Great Lakes. And as the fire in the hearth begins to burn down into soft gray ash, you can feel your thoughts becoming as light as the smoke that drifts up the chimney and into the vast, dark night where the owls call out to one another in a language of soft hoots and rustling wings. The idea of the great multitude was a promise of inclusion and a testament to the belief that everyone deserved a piece of the future. And this belief acted as a steady heartbeat that pulsed through the workshop and into the very steel of the machines being built there. And now, as the narrative slows down even further, you can see the first Model T standing in the doorway, bathed in the silver light of a full moon, looking like a silent sentinel of a new age that is both exciting and deeply peaceful. And the metal is cool to the touch, and the rubber of the tires smells of the earth and the promise of travel, and you find yourself leaning back into the softness of your own surroundings.
Weary traveler and the dreamer alike, the thousands of lights inside the factory begin to twinkle and reflect off the glass surfaces, creating 1,000,000 points of light that look like a constellation brought down to Earth to rest for a while. It is a place of immense scale, yet it feels as intimate as a quiet library, because the light softens the edges of the machines and turns the hard surfaces of the industrial world into something ethereal and soft. You find yourself sitting on a wooden bench near a wall of windows, watching the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky, and the Crystal Palace seems to breathe with you in a slow and steady cadence that matches the rise and fall of your chest as you sink deeper into a state of total tranquility. The transparency of the walls reminds you that there is a connection between the work of the hand and the beauty of the natural world, and that even in the heart of a great city, one can find a sanctuary of light and peace that feels as old as the sun itself. And as the night grows darker and the moon begins its slow ascent over the roof of the factory, the glass turns into a deep velvet black that reflects the flickering lamps inside, like distant campfires on a quiet plain. You feel the weight of the day lifting off your shoulders as you contemplate the vastness of the space and the quiet dignity of the architecture that was built to celebrate the clarity of a new vision for the great multitude. The air inside is still and carries the faint scent of clean oil and ozone, and the distant sound of a clock chiming the hour, which echoes softly through the high rafters before fading into a perfect silence that wraps around you like a cocoon of safety and comfort. And as you close your eyes in this dream of glass and steel, you can still see the light behind your eyelids, a soft and fading glow that tells you the world is bright and the future is secure, and there is nothing left to do but drift away into the velvet darkness of a deep and restorative sleep, where the Crystal Palace remains a silent guardian of your dreams, and the light of the morning is still many, many hours away. And you are floating now on a sea of calm transparency, where every thought is clear and every breath is a gift of peace, and the world is a beautiful place of light and glass and endless quiet rest. In the quiet shadows of the old workshops, before the world learned the language of the assembly line, there was a slow and heavy stillness that filled the air like a thick winter fog over a valley, where the scent of sawdust and cold iron hung suspended in the dim light of small windows, and every single motor car was born from a long and tedious labor that felt more like the building of a grand cathedral than the making of a machine. You can imagine the silence of a dusty floor where a single wooden chassis sits on heavy blocks and does not move for weeks at a time, while men with tired eyes and slow, deliberate movements walk back and forth fetching tools from distant walls and carrying heavy components one by one across the vast, empty space. It was a world of stationary effort where the car stayed still and the men revolved around it like planets around a cold sun, and every bolt was turned by hand, and every piece of wood was shaved with a manual plane that made a rhythmic curling sound as the
Forever and nothing was certain. The shadows in the corner of the workshop are soft and inviting, and the sound of the wind rattling the window panes is the only thing that breaks the heavy silence of the night. You find yourself sinking into the velvet cushions of a quiet thoughts where the frustration of the past is smoothed away by the distance of time and the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of history. And as the stars turn above the silent factory and the men go home to their beds, the unfinished cars remain in the dark, waiting for a revolution that they cannot yet imagine, and you are there with them in the stillness, feeling the weight of the iron and the softness of the dust and the absolute peace of a world that has stopped moving for a while to let you find your way into a deep and dreamless sleep where the only thing that moves is the breath in your lungs and the slow drifting of your mind toward the horizon of the morning. In the quiet hum of a mind that was always searching for a better way, there came a moment of sudden clarity that felt like the sun breaking through a thick canopy of leaves on a still afternoon in the Midwest, where the air is warm and the shadows are long and peaceful. It was an ordinary day when Henry stood in the observation gallery of a large meatpacking plant in Chicago, watching a sight that most people would find mundane, but to him it was a revelation of perfect and rhythmic geometry. He saw the overhead trolleys moving with a slow and inevitable grace, carrying their heavy loads along a silver rail that wound through the building like a quiet river flowing toward the sea. And as he watched, he noticed that the men did not have to walk or search or carry heavy burdens from one side of the room to the other, because the work came to them at a steady and predictable pace that allowed each person to stay in their place and perform their task with a calm and focused energy that seemed to eliminate the very idea of hurry. This was the disassembly line of the packing houses, where a long line of hooks moved in a continuous loop, and Henry realized with a start that if you could take a thing apart with such smooth efficiency, you could surely put something together using the same hypnotic rhythm. He stood there for a long time, leaning against the metal railing, while the sounds of the facility faded into a low and rhythmic background hum that felt like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. And in his mind he began to replace the hooks with chassis and the overhead rails with moving belts of thick canvas and iron. He imagined a world where a car moved like a slow boat on a calm canal, passing from one station to the next, while the workers stood still as statues, only moving their hands in small, precise circles to tighten a bolt or set a wheel in place. This was his eureka moment, although it did not arrive with a loud shout, but rather with a quiet settling of the spirit as the pieces of a grand puzzle finally clicked into their proper alignment. As you listen to the steady flow of this realization, you can feel your own thoughts beginning to drift along that same moving line, where everything is orderly and nothing is rushed, and the world moves forward with a gentle and unstoppable momentum that requires no effort from you at all. He went back to his workshop with the image of that moving line burned into his memory, like the light of a
Matched the sliding sound of metal on stone. As the chassis moved past the first man, he reached out and placed a part with a soft metallic click, and as it reached the second man, another piece was added without anyone having to walk a single step or search for a misplaced wrench in the shadows of a workbench. The simplicity of the motion was hypnotic, like the slow crawl of a shadow across a sundial, or the way a leaf floats down a lazy river in the middle of a quiet forest, where time seems to stretch and expand until every second feels as long as an hour. The rope hummed with tension, and the floorboards creaked ever so slightly, but the work proceeded with a newfound fluidity that felt as natural as breathing or the turning of a heavy millstone in a valley stream. The men found that they could focus entirely on the task in front of them because the work was coming to them like a gift from the machine, and the old frustration of walking back and forth began to dissolve into a state of calm in repetitive motion that made the heavy iron feel lighter and the long hours seem shorter. As you listen to the steady scraping sound of that first chassis moving across the floor, you can feel your own mind drifting into a state of relaxed observation, where the details of the room begin to blur into a soft haze of gray and silver, and the only thing that matters is the slow and inevitable forward progress of the line. The experiment proved that the man should be the center of the world, and the works should revolve around him like a moon around a planet, and this realization brought a sense of order to the chaos of the factory that felt like the settling of dust after a long wind, or the arrival of a quiet evening after a busy day. They pulled the chassis again and again, each time refining the height of the rope and the speed of the walk until the movement became a symphony of efficiency that was as beautiful to watch as it was productive to manage. The rope became a symbol of the invisible thread that connects all human effort, and as it stretched across the floor, it pulled the 19th century into the 20th with a steady and irresistible force that no one could turn back. The light in the factory began to change as the sun moved lower in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the path of the rope and making the steel of the chassis glow with a soft and ethereal light that seemed to promise a world of abundance and ease for everyone. You can feel the coolness of the concrete and the smell of the hemp rope and the steady pulse of the factory as it begins to find its new heartbeat in the movement of the line, and your eyes grow heavier with every inch that the frame travels across the floor toward the finish line where the first completed car of the experiment stood waiting in the shadows. The success of the day was measured not in loud cheers, but in the quiet satisfaction of men who realized they had discovered a secret of the universe, which is that motion is life and rhythm is peace, and that when things move together in harmony, the world becomes a smaller and more comfortable place for everyone to live. And now the rope is coiled.
Long and winding road through a dark forest, but the 93 minutes were like a straight path across a sunlit meadow where the destination is always in sight and the journey is effortless and smooth. As you listen to the story, you can feel the heavy burden of time being lifted off your own shoulders, just as it was lifted from the backs of the workers who no longer had to struggle against the friction of inefficiency. The world outside was still moving at the pace of a horse and a hand plow, but inside the walls of the factory, a new heartbeat had been discovered that vibrated with the power of 1,000,000 synchronized thoughts. The 93 minutes became a symphony of assembly, where the engine met the frame and the wheels met the axles in a dance that was as repetitive and soothing as the waves of the ocean hitting a sandy shore in the middle of a warm night. The record-shattering pace was a silent revolution that happened in the space between heartbeats, where the complexity of a machine was simplified into a series of small and gentle acts that anyone could master with a calm mind and a steady hand. And as the clock ticks toward the end of the shift, you can see the finished cars rolling off the line one after another, like a line of dark beetles emerging into the light, and each one represents a victory over the limitations of the old world. The efficiency was so complete that it created a sense of profound stillness in the center of the factory, where the air was quiet and the light was golden, and the work seemed to happen by itself, as if by some invisible magic that had been woven into the very steel of the building. You find yourself drifting now into that same 93-minute rhythm, where everything is falling into place and there is no more need to hurry or worry about the passing of the hours, because the line is moving and the work is being done, and you are free to simply exist in the flow of the moment. The 93 minutes are like a long and peaceful dream, where you travel from one end of a vast and beautiful landscape to the other without ever feeling tired or lost, and by the time you reach the end, you are whole and complete and ready for the quiet of the night. The miracle of production was a gift of time back to the world, and as the factory lights grow dim and the machines slow to a silent halt, you can feel that gift in the way your body sinks into the softness of your bed, in the way your mind lets go of the details of the day. The records were shattered and the world was changed, but the end result was a deeper kind of peace that comes when a difficult task is made simple and a long journey is made short. And now the clock on the wall slows its ticking until it matches the pace of your own sleeping heart, and the 93 minutes stretch out into an eternity of restful quiet, where the only thing that matters is the soft darkness and the promise of a deep and restorative slumber that will last until the world begins its rhythmic dance once again in the light of a new morning. In the quiet transition of the early 20th century, there was a softening of the air inside the great halls of industry, where the old world of the master craftsman began to blend into the new world of the specialized laborer, like the slow merging of twilight into a deep and starless night. You can imagine a man who once spent his entire life learning the secret language of wood and steel sitting by a small window in a dusty shop where he labored over every curve of a spoke and every grain of a dashboard with a slow and rhythmic patience that felt as timeless as the growth of the trees outside. But as the factory
can feel the weight of your own specialized existence, where you are only required to breathe and to rest, and to let the world move on without your intervention. The factory is a place of deep shadows and soft golden lights, where the blue shirts of the men blend into the gray of the steel, and the only thing that stands out is the steady and hypnotic motion of the assembly line, carrying the dreams of a nation toward the horizon. The specialized task is a form of meditation where the repetition of the act lulls the spirit into a state of total tranquility, and the passage of time is marked only by the arrival of the next part and the soft metallic click of success. You find yourself sinking into the comfort of this mechanical rhythm, where you are safe and supported by the efforts of 1,000 others who are also doing their part to keep the world turning in its orbit. And now the humming of the machine begins to fade into the quiet of the evening, and the workers put down their tools and walk out into the cool Michigan air, where the smell of clover and damp earth replaces the scent of oil and iron. The massive machine is at rest, and the vital cogs are going home to sleep in their warm beds, and the transition from the old way to the new is complete in the silence of the night. You are one of them now, resting in the knowledge that your part is done and the world is whole, and the only thing left to do is to sink into the velvet darkness and let the humming of the heart lead you into a deep and restorative slumber that knows no worry and no hurry and no end until the sun rises again on a world that was built by the hands of many, working as one. In the deepening shadows of the industrial age, there came a time when the rhythmic pulse of the factory began to feel heavy, like the air before a summer storm, where the clouds are dark and low, and the wind is stopped moving through the trees entirely. And this was the period when the great machine of progress met a quiet resistance in the hearts of the men who stood along the line for hour after hour and day after day,
performing the same small motion until the world seemed to narrow down to a single silver bolt or a spinning gear that never stopped turning. There was a grueling monotony that settled over the Highland Park plant, like a layer of gray dust that no brush could sweep away, and the men began to feel like shadows of themselves, moving in a trance of iron, while the sun rose and set outside the glass walls, without them ever truly feeling its warmth on their skin. It was a time of great tension, where the speed of the line was a silent taskmaster that demanded a level of focus so intense that the mind would eventually begin to drift away, like a boat unmoored on a dark lake, searching for a shore that it could not find. And as the months passed, the exhaustion of the spirit became more profound than the exhaustion of the body, leading many to simply lay down their wrenches and walk out of the great doors, never to return again to the hum and the clatter of the assembly line. This was the era of the great quitting, when the turnover of laborers was so high that the factory felt like a river that was constantly in the dark, and the world is waiting for the announcement of the $5 day, which will change everything yet again. But for tonight, there is only the stillness and the heavy weight of the blankets, and the knowledge that the struggle is over, and the rest is finally begun. In the cold and gray morning of early January 1914, a soft vibration of excitement began to ripple through the frosted streets of Detroit, where the breath of men rose in white plumes against the winter air, and the world was about to hear a sound more powerful than any steam engine or clanging hammer, as the news began to spread like a gentle wave washing over a quiet shore that Henry had decided to do the impossible by doubling the daily wage of his workers to $5 a day, which was an amount of money so vast and unexpected that it felt like a dream descending upon the waking world to change the very fabric of reality for thousands of families who had only known the slow struggle of making ends meet. And as the announcement echoed through the tall glass hallways of Highland Park, you could feel a collective sigh of relief and wonder that seemed to settle the restless energy of the factory into a deep and satisfied hum of productivity and hope. This was the birth of the American middle class, born not from a battlefield, but from a simple piece of paper that recognized the value of a man's time and the dignity of his labor beneath the bright lights of the Crystal Palace. And as you imagine the faces of the men hearing this news, you can see the tension leaving their shoulders and the weary lines around their eyes softening as they realize that they would no longer just be building cars for the wealthy, but would soon be able to afford the very machines they spent their lives assembling with such care and repetition. It was a social earthquake that shook the foundations of industry and replaced the old fear of poverty with a new sense of security and belonging that felt as warm and comforting as a heavy wool blanket on a snowy night in Michigan. The $5 day turned the factory into a destination of desire, where men from all over the country and even from across the ocean began to gather at the gates with a quiet patience, waiting for their chance to join the ranks of this new army of prosperity that was marching toward a future of comfort and stability. And as the work began each day with this new promise, the rhythm of the assembly line changed from a grueling monotony into a steady and purposeful dance of creation, where every bolt tightened and every wheel fitted felt like a step toward a better home and a brighter education for children who were currently sleeping soundly in their beds. The air in the factory became still and focused as the turnover of workers vanished overnight and was replaced by a loyalty as strong as the steel girders overhead and a silence of contentment that allowed the mind to rest even while the hands stayed busy with the familiar tasks of the line. The new American middle class began to take shape in the small brick houses and the quiet suburbs where gardens were planted and pianos were bought, and the evening light was spent not in worry, but in the soft conversation of people who knew their future was secure and their labor was honored. You can feel the weight of this security in your own limbs as you drift through the history of this moment, where the clatter of the machine is muffled by the softness of a well-earned rest, and the world feels like a place where things are finally falling into their proper and peaceful alignment.
The $5 day was a beacon of light that reached out across the dark landscape of the early industrial age to show that the machine could serve the man just as much as the man served the machine. And this balance brought a profound sense of equilibrium to the world that allows you to let go of any lingering thoughts of the
Smell of fresh hay and clover in the morning air. For the first time in history, a person could travel to the next town and back before the sun had even reached its zenith, and this newfound freedom felt like a deep and cooling breath of mountain air to a nation that had been bound by the speed of a walking gait. The Model T was a simple and honest machine that didn't demand luxury or pretense, but offered instead a rugged reliability that mirrored the spirit of the people who drove it through rain and mud and snow without a single complaint from its iron soul. As you listen to the steady flow of this story, you can feel the slow rotation of the wheels as they turn across the vast stretches of the American plains, carrying the dreams of the great multitude toward a future that was no longer a distant star, but a reality that sat right there in the shed beside the house. The horses grew quiet in their stalls as the night air filled with the low and comforting chug of the engine returning home from a long day's journey, and the world felt more connected than it ever had before as the miles between neighbors dissolved into mere minutes of pleasant travel through the cooling evening breeze. There was a profound sense of peace in this mechanical abundance because it meant that the world was no longer divided into those who could move and those who were stuck, but was instead becoming a place where everyone could see the sunset from a different vantage point every single day of the year. The price of $260 was more than just a number. It was a key that unlocked the gates of the horizon and allowed the common man to claim a piece of the distance for himself and his children, who looked out the windows of the car with wide and wondering eyes as the trees blurred into a soft green mist. The dirt roads began to feel the weight of a million turning wheels, and the dust that rose behind them was like a golden veil cast over the past as the country moved forward with a gentle and unstoppable momentum that felt as natural as the change of the seasons or the slow progression of the stars across the velvet sky. You can feel your own mind becoming as quiet as those old country roads at midnight, when the only sound is the wind whispering through the telephone wires and the distant lonesome call of an owl in the woods, while the world rests in the security of its new mobility. The transition from the horse to the car was a long and sleepy process that allowed the heart of the nation to adjust to a new rhythm that was both faster and yet somehow more peaceful, because it removed the labor of the journey and replaced it with the joy of the arrival. And as you sink deeper into the warmth of your blankets, you can imagine the millions of Model Ts resting in their garages and barns across the country, their metal cooling in the night air, and their headlights extinguished like closed eyes in a deep and restful slumber. The world has found its pace, and the horses are dreaming in the fields, and the common man is safe in his home, knowing that the world is waiting for him just beyond the driveway whenever he chooses to wake. But for now, there is only the silence of the gravel road, and the softness of the dark, and the steady pulse of a history that moved from 800 to 260 so that you could finally
Had a garage that looked like a small temple dedicated to the freedom of movement, and every garden was a place of solitude and reflection that had been made possible by the factory's output. Across the distant hills, the world was no longer a collection of isolated islands, but a single interconnected tapestry of movement and rest, where the distance between 2 points was no longer measured in days of struggle, but in minutes of peaceful observation through a glass windshield. And as the night settles over these new suburban streets, you can see the lights in the windows flickering out one by one as the families settle into their beds in houses that would not exist without the moving assembly line and the dream of the common car. The highways are quiet now, silver under the light of a full moon, and the gas stations are dark, and the suburbs are wrapped in a thick and comforting silence that feels as deep as the roots of the ancient oaks that still stand at the edges of the new developments.
You find yourself drifting along one of these smooth gray roads in your mind, moving toward a destination that is nothing more than a place of total tranquility and quietude, where the air is cool and the stars are bright, and the map of your own thoughts is as clear and open as the great plains themselves. The transformation of the land was a slow and heavy process that has now reached its final and peaceful state, where everything has its place and everyone has a home, and the world is at rest in the cradle of its own design. And as you sink deeper into the softness of your own surroundings, you can feel the stability of the concrete and the permanence of the roads and the safety of the suburbs protecting you from the chaos of the world as you close your eyes and let the map of the night lead you into a deep and restorative sleep that will last until the sun rises over the paved horizon of a brand new day. In the quiet echoes of history, as the great ships moved slowly across the vast and rhythmic swells of the Atlantic Ocean, there carried with them an idea that was as heavy as iron and as light as a dream, known as Fordism, which began to drift into the ancient cities and quiet workshops of the Old World, like a gentle fog that settles over a harbor at dawn. As you imagine these large wooden crates being unloaded onto the docks of Liverpool and Le Havre and Hamburg, you can feel the slow and steady pulse of a new logic taking root in the soil of Europe, where for centuries things had been made with the slow hands of artisans in dim rooms, but now the air began to vibrate with the concept of the line and the beauty of the identical part. This blueprint for global industry did not just stay within the walls of car factories, but began to seep into the very clock-making shops of the Black Forest, where the tiny gears and delicate springs began to move with a synchronized precision that mirrored the great Highland Park plant across the sea. Imagine a clockmaker sitting at a heavy oak desk, watching a row of brass escapements move past him on a miniature conveyor belt, and the sound of 1,000 ticking hearts becomes a low and hypnotic lullaby that tells the story of a world finding its rhythm. The idea spread to the production of household appliances, turning the heavy labor of the home into a series of quiet and efficient gestures as the first refrigerators and washing machines were born from the same logic of mass production that made the Model T a household name. You can feel the coolness.
Looks back upon the path it has traveled since the first fires were lit in the heart of Highland Park. We find ourselves standing at the edge of a silent forest where the trees whisper secrets to the wind about a time before the smoke and the iron, when the sky was a deep and endless blue that knew nothing of the gray haze of mass production. There was a certain weight to this reflection, like the feeling of damp earth underfoot, or the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against a winter chill, as we acknowledge the environmental costs of a world that learned to move too fast and to build too much, without pausing to listen to the slow heartbeat of the ancient mountains and the steady flow of the crystal rivers that once ran clear and cold toward the sea. The relentless pace of the modern industrial world is a rhythm that has settled deep within our own bones, making our thoughts move in rapid circles, like the belts of a conveyor that never stops turning. And yet, in this quiet moment of the story, we can feel that pace beginning to slow down and dissolve into a state of total stillness, where the demands of the clock no longer hold any power over the resting soul. We think of the psychological toll of a life spent in the service of the line, where the mind was often asked to become as mechanical as the steel it touched, and we feel a profound sense of compassion for the quiet fatigue that has settled over the generations who built the modern dream with their own steady hands. The shadow of the machine is not a dark place, but a soft and shaded sanctuary where we can finally put down the burden of constant growth and simply exist in the fading light of a long and complex century. As you listen to the low and rhythmic flow of these words, you can feel the air in the room becoming thick and comforting, like a warm mist that rises from a meadow at twilight, and the sounds of the modern world begin to retreat into the far distance until they are nothing more than a faint and lonely hum that cannot disturb your peace.
We contemplate the vast piles of discarded iron and the weary stretches of pavement that now cover the once wild plains, and we realize that the earth, too, is searching for a moment of rest and a chance to breathe in the silence of the moonlit hours. There is a beauty in this recognition of
Most beautiful part of the story, where the factory itself becomes a dream of silver and light, floating in the vast dark space of the past, and you are free to let go of the modern world in all its noise, to find your way back to the simple and essential quietude of your own breathing. The legacy of Highland Park is not just in the things it made, but in the rest it eventually provided, by making the world efficient enough to allow us these long and silent nights of total repose. And as the last ember of the story glows with a soft orange light before fading into gray ash, you can feel the entire world resting with you in a state of perfect and harmonious equilibrium, where the past and the future meet in the stillness of the present moment. The journey through the 15 paragraphs is complete, and the history is told, and the only thing that remains is the deep and restorative darkness that invites you to sleep without worry and without end, until the light of a new day finds you whole and refreshed in the heart of the world that was built for you. And now, the silence is absolute, and the air is still, and the legacy of the engine is a quiet song that lulls you into the deepest parts of the night, where the stars are the only lights left burning, and you are finally and completely at rest.